Everyone to this webinar. My name is Aude Locher, and I am the Water Resources Outreach Specialist with Lake Champlain Sea Grant, a member organization of the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network, or HazMaTON. Can you please change slide, Kelsey? Thank you. Our network is a binational collaborative of specialists from the Great Lakes, Lake Champlain, Hudson River, and St. Lawrence River regions, focused on reducing risks associated with multiple modes of oil and other hazardous materials transportation. Our network is committed to the dissemination of accurate, neutral, and data-driven information through education, outreach, and relationship building in order to improve public safety, the region's economy, and environmental stewardship of our water resources. To that end, we are pleased to bring you the first webinar of our 2024 summer webinar series. These webinars will be monthly until September. And today's webinar will take you to Canada, more specifically to the Experimental Lakes Area managed by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. It is a very unique place where scientists get to manipulate small lakes to understand how humans affect freshwater systems. It is very exciting to have a research scientist from this unique place, Dr. Rodriguez Gil, as our speaker today. So before I introduce our speaker, I have a few logistics to share with you. So thank you, Kelsey. This webinar is being recorded. The recording with closed captions will be publicly available on Minnesota Sea Grant's and Lake Champlain Sea Grant's YouTube channels and on HazMaTON's webinar page, where you can view past webinars. You are in listen and view only mode. We invite you to submit questions and comments via the question and answer box in your Zoom toolbar, which is at the bottom of your screen. We will be collecting those for the Q&A session that will take place following the presentation, and that will be led by my colleague at Minnesota Sea Grant, Kelsey Prayoda. You can upvote questions that are of particular interest to you. At the bottom of your screen, you will also find a button to live transcriptions, closed captions, so feel free to use this function if that's helpful. And it is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Dr. José Luis Rodriguez Gil. So Dr. Rodriguez Gil has over a decade of experience looking at the fate and effects of contaminants in freshwater ecosystems. He has worked with many contaminants, such as pesticides, pharmaceuticals, and oil spills, among others. As I mentioned earlier, he is a research scientist at IISD Experimental Lakes Area. So there's a poll going on here. So maybe I'm gonna let people finish the poll here before I finish the introduction. Okay, I think, Kelsey, would you mind ending the poll now? I think, Okay, so we're going to go to the result of the poll in a minute. Just wanted to finish the introduction here. So as part of Dr. Rodriguez Gil's research, he is leading ecological level studies to understand the complex effects of contaminants in freshwater ecosystems. In addition to this work, he is an environmental risk assessor. He has compiled and used data from the fields of environmental toxicology and environmental chemistry to understand current and future risks of contaminants to the environment and human health. He is also an associate professor at the University of Manitoba, where he teaches data science, environmental risk assessment, and he advises undergraduate and graduate students. And today, he will share lessons learned from his research on the fate and effect of oil spills and cleanup approaches in the Canadian Experimental Lakes Area. So, Kelsey, you can stop sharing your screen so Dr. Rodriguez Gil can share his. Maybe in the meantime, Kelsey, we could share the results of the poll that was given a couple of minutes ago. So we asked attendees a few questions about the webinar series and a question about how if you would be comfortable describing oil spill research conducted at IISD Experimental Lakes Area to a friend of a coworker, and we have a mix. About a quarter of people strongly agree or agree, which is good, and we have a few folks that are either undecided, disagreed, or strongly disagreed. Okay, so we really hope that this webinar will give you some more insights of what they do at this pretty unique research area. And just a quick reminder that if you have any questions during the talk, you are welcome to put them in the Q&A box at any point. So with this, I'm going to let José Luis take over. We are again very excited to have him. And José Luis, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you all for the nice introduction. And thank you everybody for inviting me and having me here today. First, a little warning about technology. I am currently at the Experimental Lakes Area, so I'm streaming to you via Starlink. So I'm crossing my fingers that the connection stays good for the rest of the presentation. So if something happens, I apologize in advance. But yes, it is incredibly exciting to be here today to talk a little bit about the work that we've been conducting at the ELA for the past, I can even calculate the numbers, since 2017 in our oil-related program of research. So first of all, before we get started, I want to make sure that those of you who are not familiar with Experimental Lakes Area get a little bit of an idea of what this facility is. So we are a research facility that's located in northwestern Ontario, Canada. And the main uniqueness about what we do here is that we have access to 58 lakes that the government of Canada set aside for scientific research. So we are allowed to manipulate these lakes in any way that we want, of course, with oversight and approvals. But we can manipulate these lakes to test anything from basic ecological theory to, as we are going to see today, the effects of contaminants in aquatic systems. Of course, all the work that we do at the Experimental Lakes Area in these 58 lakes, we have to thank the actual owners of the land where we are sitting. The ELA is located in Anishinaabe Nation territory, as well as the Treaty 3 territory, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. So we are very grateful that they allow us to do our work in their land. And we want to believe that we have a very good relationship with the First Nations in the area who are kept up to date, and they do have a say on every work that we do. So apart from the lakes, we also have a full research station on site that's growing in our capacity every year a little bit more. So we are able to do actual research. If I drop you on any of our labs, it would be hard to tell that we are actually in the middle of the forest 3 hours away from the closest city, because it would look like pretty much any other university laboratory. So we do have a very unique situation where we have access to these lakes that are otherwise non-impacted by people, but also the capacity to run tests and do science on site, which is great. As someone who works here, I can tell you it is definitely a great opportunity for us. So part of our mandate is that we are supposed to do ecosystem scale research. We have the lakes, so that's what we want to make sure that we can do. We do have, as I mentioned, the legal right to do so. We do have amendments to all the laws in Canada that they say that you shall not pollute. There's a note saying there, unless you are the ELA, in which case you are allowed to do it, obviously, through our regular processes. We do have a strong governance system. As I mentioned, there's continuous communication with the First Nations around us, and also all government agencies and ministries and other stakeholders that are involved with the management of the place. We always want to mimic real life pollution scenarios. When one of the limitations of when we do work in a lake is that the number of experimental units that we have is always limited. We don't have the ability to have too many replicates or long regression designs with a lot of levels of manipulation. So whatever studies we do, we try to make sure that they represent the real world, because we only have one shot at it. And we always have the requirement to return the lakes to their original state. That's also from selfish point of view, because we need to keep on working on those lakes. So we need them to be back to as pristine as possible when we are done with those tests. And of course, we like involving all the partners. As I mentioned, usually these studies are a one-off. So we want to make sure that whatever questions we are asking, they are actually meaningful to everybody that might find that information useful. We've been doing research at the Experimental Lakes Area for 55 years, I believe. Actually 56. This might be the 56th field season since 1968. And you can see there's a lot of work on many things: acid rain, mercury, pharmaceuticals, and personal care products. And of course, what I'm going to talk about today here is listed as diluted bitumen, but is truly many other oils and oil-related work. Started officially in 2017, but discussions about it have been going for a few years before that. So you could say that probably around a decade between when the conversation has started and today. That's the extent of our oil program. So what were the motivations for us to start working on oil spills and oil-related research? The main fact is, well, we are in Canada, and Canada is the third largest crude oil. Well, it has the third largest crude oil deposit, so we are a big oil producer. Of course, we all know that that's in large part centered around the oil sands area that's straddled between Alberta and Saskatchewan, but maybe in Alberta. And we know that the main product that we have access to is bitumen, which means that it is a bit of an unconventional crude, which means that we also have limited information of its fate, its behavior, and many other things for which we usually have a little bit more data from other more conventional crude oils. We also know that Alberta and Saskatchewan happen to be landlocked. So if we want to move this oil somewhere else, there has to be a network of transportation, whether it is pipelines or railroads or road transport. It needs to get out of Alberta. So here's just a little bit of a schematic that you might all be very familiar, and it's actually a little bit outdated from 2019 about pipeline networks moving that oil from Alberta. But you can see that these networks cover a large portion of Canada, a large portion of the boreal Canada. And if you've ever flown over Canada, you know that a lot of that area looks like this. And this is a problem because we do have a fair bit of data and knowledge about how to respond to oil spills in marine environments, coastal areas, but we don't have that much information on how to respond to oil spills in freshwater, particularly in heterogeneous, small lake, patchy systems like the boreal. And I have to mention that a lot of you who are tuning in from Minnesota and Michigan, you will relate to this picture, as this is not only a Canadian ecosystem, it is shared by Northern US as well. So I mentioned that bitumen is an unconventional crude oil. About 2015 or so, there was a call between, it was both in the States and in Canada, between the Royal Society of Canada and the National Academies. They put both out reports asking for more research on information that was needed when looking at particularly bitumen as well as freshwater spills. And if you look at the list of research questions that was on that Royal Society of Canada report, a lot of them actually seem to fit perfectly the experimental lakes area. So number one, understand environmental impacts in inland rivers and wetlands. Number two, look at the effects of aquatic organisms at the ecosystem level. I'm going to skip a couple that were not that relevant, but number four, start a program of control field research on spill behavior and effects, and then we can continue to research to update risk assessment. So a large portion of the things that the Royal Society of Canada was asking for, we felt that we were in a position where we could actually provide some of that data. So with that in mind, we started a program of research on oil spills that actually extends 3 different projects. So these projects, you might hear me mentioning the acronyms through the presentation. These are the Boreal Project, the Forest Project, and the Floater Project. I'm gonna talk about all these 3. But first, I need to mention that, of course, this is a large program of research. So it is several projects, each of them with a very large team of PIs and students. So I think Boreal, we had, I think, 12 grad students. Forest have maybe another 7, 8. Floater, another 2 or 3. So we are talking upwards of 20 plus graduate students with their associate PIs and institutions. And of course, we had a lot of support from government agencies, consulting, and other institutions. So nothing that I'm going to say here I can claim ownership or responsibility, sole responsibility for. Everything has been teamwork. So I'm going to give my thanks in advance to everybody that was involved in this work, because everything that you're going to see is a large team effort. A bit of what these projects try to accomplish before I go into each of them. So Boreal was a first step. We were hoping to have a very simplistic, very worst case scenario idea of how an oil spill in a boreal forest looked like. So the idea was to put oil in an enclosure in the lake, don't touch it, and just see what happens. That's the basic idea of it. The second part, forest, what we tried to do was to make it a little bit more realistic. This is a study that was looking at shoreline areas with a spill that would have happened in the area between the water and the shoreline, so that water land interface. And also applying different remediation techniques, non-invasive remediation techniques. And then Floater was taking that even farther by fine-tuning on some specific remediation techniques, particularly the use of engineering flooding wetlands. So it's a tier approach where we start with the basic, most simple approach to more and more applied as we progress. So I also want to mention that because these are such a large program of research and we have a limited amount of time, I'm going to be relatively light on data. So this presentation is going to be mostly an introduction to the different studies, what we try to accomplish, as well as a little bit of a summary and some take-home messages from each of them. So the idea is for me to introduce this work, and if any of you is interested on having a conversation after, I would be very happy to chat with any of you, and we can share actual data and maybe collaborate. So it's going to be a relatively light presentation, but it should give you a good idea of the type of questions that we've been asking and some of the answers that we've been getting. So I'm going to start with the Boreal project. This is the first one that actually took place. Started in 2017 with a pilot project with inland enclosures, and then the bulk of the work happened in 2018. with follow-up going up to last summer. So again, because these are different projects with different PIs, I just want to have a picture and a list of everybody that was involved on the Boreal project. You have the main PIs for the project marked there in light blue. So Jules Blais at the University of Ottawa, Mark Hanson at U Manitoba, and Diane Orihel at the University of Queen's University. And of course, with support from the ELA, Vince Palas, our head scientist. And at this time, during this project, I was actually, you might see my name, actually, my name is nowhere there because I'm giving the presentation, but I would have been listed under the University of Ottawa because I was a postdoc under Jules Blais during this first project. So that was my role in the project. Basically, what we did is what you see in your screens. We created in-lake enclosures, fairly large, 10 meters in diameter, and we just spilled diluted bitumen into them. And then we monitored these enclosures for a whole summer, and we measured a plethora of things. So the problem with bitumen, and I'm going to continue a little bit the intro, and I know that a lot of you are perfectly familiar with this, so bear with me, but I just want to point to a few peculiarities about bitumen and diluted bitumen that kind of drove the things that we measure and why we measure them in this study. So if you're familiar with the bitumen from the Alberta oil sands, you know that it is not oil. It is a mixture of sand and crude oil, highly complex to mine and extract. And of course, the compound itself is highly degraded and very viscous, partially solid, closer to asphalt than it would be to a conventional crude oil. That means that the density of the product itself is extremely high, and that makes it very difficult to transport, particularly through pipelines. Meaning that you have to come up with a solution, and that solution is to dilute that bitumen with some sort of other lighter petroleum product. That's how you create what we know as diluted bitumen or dilbit. And this dilbit is an engineered mixture that's created basically so you can ship this product, particularly through pipelines. This means that this engineered mixture, it is a mixture, but it's a mixture made of two very different things. On the one side, we have the bitumen itself with high molecular weight compounds like hopanes, large pHs and PACs, resins, asphaltanes. And on the other side, we have the diluent itself, which is all the low molecular weight products. So all the BTECs, the small pHs, and some very short chain alkenes. And the distribution obviously depends on the products that you're using, the bitumen itself and the diluent that you're using, as well as the season. They tend to increase the amount of diluent in the winter to make it a little bit more easy to flow, but it's usually around 30 to and 30-70. That's the distribution between the diluent and the bitumen itself. The question that we had is what happens to this engineered mixture when there's a spill? Of course, we had already some information on this from the Kalamazoo River spill because that was a diluted bitumen spill, but we wanted to answer questions in a more controlled space and questions that could not be answered on that real world scenario. When we release a mixture like this into the environment, there's several things that can happen to it. And of course, the idea is that the diluent and the bitumen itself eventually are going to separate. And the diluted part, the diluent, because it's extremely volatile, will dissipate relatively quick. Okay. One problem with that is that some of those compounds could be a human health issue. So in the case of a spill, proper PPE for the responders should be needed because all those low molecular weight compounds would be leaving that mixture and would be volatilized. So for the first few hours, definitely that should be a priority. There's also an issue that all of these low molecular weight compounds, they are actually the ones that are water soluble. So they are some of the ones that could pose a higher risk to aquatic organisms. But on the positive side, they could also be readily degradable. So there's a balance between bioavailability and degradation and removal going on at the same time. On the other side, the bitumen part itself is much higher density, which is a problem because it could lead to the submergence of this portion of the mixture. But on the positive side, if you want to call it side, we know that it's likely low solubility, which means that it might not get to the water column where it could affect the water column organisms as readily as the low molecular weight or compounds from the diluent would do. So may pose a bit of a limit, a lower risk to the organisms there. Unfortunately, that also makes it more persistent. So perhaps chronic effects could be more likely. It is highly recalcitrant, so biodegradation and other degradation processes would be slower. So this is the kind of conceptual framework that we started with when we proposed the study. So part of the questions that we designed were addressed to kind of understand this double nature, this double-headed monster that we had in front of us, trying to behave in two completely different ways at the same time. So our objectives were, of course, objective number one, to support spill response. And that was mainly trying to answer questions about fate. Where does the oil and the different components of the oil end up? Do they volatilize? Do they end up in the water column? Do they go to the sediment? We wanted to understand the weathering. How does the oil change over time? What happens to the different portions of that mixture? Does the mixture remain consistent over time, et cetera, as well as behavior. And behavior was pretty much answering one question, and that question is, does it sink? Because, as I mentioned, the idea is when this mixture gets into the environment, that separation of the two phases would occur, and the bitumen itself has a higher density than the water, so it should be expected to sink. The question at that time was, when would that happen? Because the data that was available was either from coastal areas. Of course, marine and coastal water has a higher density than freshwater, so time to sink would be different in that environment than in a boreal lake. And we had data from the Kalamazoo River spill, which was perhaps not as representative as from our environment either, because it is flowing water, highly energetic, and of course we know it happened over a high flow time, so not quite the same situation. So understanding what would happen if the spill would actually take place on a boreal lake. And objective number two was to support risk assessment. So if the oil is there, is it really a problem? And of course, that question is intended to help on choosing what approaches are taken to cleaning it up in kind of like a NEBA, a net environmental benefit analysis kind of approach. And for these, we have to go back to that Kalamazoo River spill. And I'm just showing some pictures of the intensity of the recovery techniques and the impact that the recovery processes themselves could have in the environment, and whether there is a reason to justify that kind of recovery. And just some other pictures of the impacts of the recovery techniques themselves. So with that intro out of the way, what did we do? So I've already mentioned a little bit that our objective with this first study was to keep it as simple as possible. It was the worst case scenario. The spill would happen directly over water. It would be a fresh diluted bitumen spill directly over water with no interaction with the shoreline, and we were not going to try to recover the oil or remediate the site. This would be trying to simulate a situation where a pipeline would break in a remote area of Canada, and perhaps a small leak that would take some time to be detected. And by the time that you detect it, there's a substantial amount of oil already in that lake. Let me show a picture first. This is kind of the setup that we had. So this is Lake 260 at the Experimental Lakes Area. Is one of our experimental lakes, and we chose a protected bay on the north of the lake. And you can see we deployed 9 in-lake mesocosms. So we had 9 experimental units. What we did is we had two controls, one that we call a near field control that was among the spill enclosures, and then we had a far field control that was a little farther away. We were trying to tease whether there was any atmospheric deposition that could have happened from things that were getting volatilized in nearby enclosures that could make it back into enclosures around them. So we had 7 experimental units available for oil. So what we decided is that we wanted to do a regression design with a range of oil spill sizes. To define how we chose those spill sizes, what we did is we plotted the cumulative probability distribution of spill of existing spills on freshwater that had taken place between 2008 and 2018 in both the US and Canada. And what you see, that shaded area, is the range of scenarios that we covered with our study. And you can see at the very top is the Kalamazoo River spill. Of course, all these spills are happening in different systems, different conditions. So what we did is we actually tried to back calculate and say, if this volume of oil had been spilled in Lake 260, what would be the oil to water ratio that would have happened? And that's the table that you see here at the bottom. And you can see that the maximum based on that data from the databases between 2008 and 2018, which would have been the Kalamazoo River spill, are 3,200 cubic meters. If it would have happened in our experimental lake, it would have resulted on a 1 to 500 oil to water ratio. So based on that information, we designed our actual exposures here that you see in the upper section with the actual volumes that we added to those enclosures. And you can see that we match pretty well that distribution with our highest treatment, simulating an oil to water ratio of 1 to 588, which is very close to what the Kalamazoo River spill would have resulted in if it had happened in our lake. And our lowest one goes a little bit closer, I believe. Yeah, we are covering around the 75th centile to the top. So we are covering the upper 25% of the spills that happened between 2008 and 2018. So with that information, we went to the field. We set up our mesocosms, which was an incredibly laborious task with a lot of grad students sweating for many, many weeks. And then we conducted the oil spill. Just so you understand a little bit better how these systems work, the systems usually we have some sort of floating collar that serves to support the system. And then we have a plastic curtain. The material, to get people to understand how it goes, I usually think of it like an IKEA bag, but it's see-through and a little bit sturdier. And that IKEA bag goes all the way to the bottom where we seal it with sandbags to make sure that we just cut a column of the lake. These are fairly large, 10 meters in diameter, and they had little sections with different partitions to allow for us to put probes in and out without going through the oil slick so as to not disturb it and also not damage our equipment. We also figured out a way of sampling water at different depths without disturbing the oil slick in the surface. So we had this center port section that was connected with tubing to the outside so we could collect samples at different depths. And of course, many other pieces of instrumentation and other tools that allowed us to measure various things through the whole summer. You can see with the boat and us on the side, the size of the enclosures, which was fairly large. So what did we see? Let's start by talking about the submergence. So answering that question, does the oil sink? And the answer is yes. Yes, it does sink. The nuance of the question is about the when and how, and that is it depends. And we found that the main driver of how long it took the oil to sink was actually the volume of oil that was spilled. And in a way that was a little bit counterintuitive. What we saw is that the more oil that is spilled, the longer it remains in the water column. So you can see here some time lapse of pictures from our highest treatment and one of our lower treatments. And you can see on the one, virtually full coverage of either just oil slick or sheen. And as time goes back, you can see the disappearance of that slick and the sinking of the oil to the bottom, which was virtually 100% on this lower treatment by day 20 or so. So very clear answer. Yes, it sinks. When and how, that's where the nuance comes in. So just a few pictures of how this submergence looks like. You can see a neutrally buoyant patty of oil in the initial stages of the sinking when the density of the oil is closer to 1, and then eventually when it sinks to the bottom. I have to mention that obviously this was the distribution of the oil, at least, was very weather dependent, particularly driven by wind, which I'm sure is not a surprise to anybody. But one thing to note here is that we did get full coverage of the enclosures with either slick or sheen every day. The moment that the sun goes down and the wind drops down, we had time-lapse cameras recording the behavior of the oil. The moment that that wind slows down at night, the oil spreads and we get 100% coverage of the whole enclosure every night virtually. If you assume that we did our calculations correct and that this could scale to a whole lake, there is a possibility that we could get full 100% coverage of the surface of the lake every night, which is something that we were not expecting in the beginning. We saw some unique behaviors of the oil depending on the enclosures and the conditions. So you can see here some tar balls that form in some of the middle range of oil treatment. Very unique formation that happened only through a couple of days, very shortly after these balls sank. And it was associated to a little choppier day with a little bit more wind. But in terms of actually quantifying the sinking, what you have here is a figure that shows the treatment in the x-axis, so how much oil we spilled, and on the y-axis, how long it took to sink. And the bottom line is when it started sinking, and the upper line is when the 100% of the oil submerged. So you can see that the lower treatments not only started earlier, but the time to full submergence was also much quicker. We are talking 7 days difference between the start of the submersion at around day 10 to the complete submergence of the oil in our lower treatment. Whereas for the highest one, we only saw a start of the submergence around day 20, and it took 39 days for it to fully sink. So if we are thinking from an oil response point of view and how much time we have to go and get it, it is going to depend on how much oil was spilled. And in general, the more oil you have, the longer you have. The working hypothesis that we have at this time is that the oil was virtually protecting itself. The thicker the layer of oil, the slower the diffusion of the oil for volatilization, photo degradation, and other processes that were taking place. So the oil was pretty much protecting itself from all of the different removal processes that would have taken place. I'm just here showing the density, so you can see that the submergence times that I just showed correlate fairly well with the density of the oil that was in the surface. And you can see that submergence took place at the moment that oil in the surface is starting approaching the same density as the water. So no surprises there. We started with the oil at around 0.9 to 2 grams per milliliter, but the moment that it started hovering around 1, that's when we started seeing the submergence. And some other interesting data that can be very helpful for planning recovery is our data on the viscosity. And you can see how the viscosity of the oil increased, and notice that it is a logarithmic scale on the y-axis, increased dramatically from 181 in the beginning all the way to above 40 million at the end. And the implications for this is that the technology that you're going to use, the different techniques to recover the soil, are definitely going to change as this viscosity increases. because your regular approaches to recover the oil are not going to work as they should with such a viscous oil. So definitely challenges that would come if you wait to recover this oil too long. And of course, this viscosity is associated with the water content in the oil. Even though we have fairly low energy systems, not a lot of wave action, not a lot of mixing, there's still formation of emulsions, and the water content in the oil increases, and that leads to that viscosity increasing. So from the oil and behavior and fate, we can see that there was a rapid evaporation, a very rapid increase in the density of the oil that led, of course, to the sinking. We saw some differences in this behavior depending on how much oil was in the enclosure. And we also saw changes in the viscosity and the water content, which are relevant for a spill response scenario. And of course, all of these were relatively concentration dependent depending on the endpoint. I don't want to go too much on the oil water chemistry because that's a little less relevant to the spill response, but more relevant to the risk assessment. But this tends to change a bit depending on the system. But you can see that there is a very clear dominance of alkylated PAHs representing upwards of 95% of the total PAHs, in this case calling them PACs because we have some sulfur and other compounds in there as well, and very low presence of actually priority EPA priority PAHs. In fact, a number of these, and you can see that some of the controls are relatively elevated. There's a large predominance of some pyrogenic compounds here as well. The area where we are, the boreal forest, is quite prone to forest fires. So that's something that we've kept in mind as we did our analysis, keeping track of those pyrogenic sources. But of course, concentration dependent, treatment dependent concentrations with our highest treatments reaching high concentrations in the water column. And for the sediment, similar, with the only difference is that we did not see a plateau and a drop on the sediment concentrations. In fact, concentrations of the different PACs in the sediment continue to increase through the duration of the study. I'm not going to touch too much on the biological effects. There's still a couple of papers, particularly microbial and others, that are still to come out, depending on timing from different student theses. But I want to point to some interesting observations, and those are related to the benthic inverts. What you see here is the number of benthic organisms in our references, including the near field, the far field, and a lake control. Sorry, these purple ones are lake controls, so outside of the enclosures. These are our near field and our far field. And this is the number of organisms, benthic organisms, that we collected from the bottom. One thing that we can see very clearly is that there's an enclosure effect. This is typical for mesocosm work, where your controls are not going to look like the actual lake for many reasons. But in general, nutrients cycle in different ways. The cortine serves as a way for periphyton to grow, so nutrients are changed on where they are distributed, so the systems are just different. So you see that the lake itself is fairly different from our controls, but the important part here is that our controls and our treatments are relatively similar, with the exception of one odd enclosure, but there's always one odd mesocosm. But no clear concentration response patterns on the number of benthic organisms collected from the bottom of the enclosures. Now, if we look at those organisms as they emerge, and we looked at that using these pyramids that you see here, which are emergence traps. So the way that this works is they get in the way as benthic organisms try to emerge from the water column. We trap them, they get trapped in that pink bottle, and then we can collect them. When we look at the successful emergence of these organisms, the pattern is completely different. You can see that there is a very clear concentration response here. So the more oil slick, the more sheen that was in the surface, the more reduction in emergence we saw. So this is an important point to note, because if you are trying to assess the effects on the benthic community by looking at what's happening in the sediment, you might completely miss the effect. If you are, on the other hand, accounting for the full cycle, assuming that these insects need to emerge, need to become airborne so they can lay eggs and complete the cycle, if you're missing that step, you're missing the effect completely. So one of the lessons learned from our work was that you do need to keep that water-air interface into consideration, because it is where the bulk of the effects are going to come from. We published a paper with Tyler Black, one of our graduate students as first author, talking about this, how in our particular study, the bulk of the effects from the spill came from that water-air interface, and not particularly from direct toxicity of the pHs to the sediment organisms. So I know that I'm getting close to the time limit, so I'm gonna show you some pictures about the second and third project. So the forest project, it is, as I mentioned, a continuation, kind of a spin-off of that original boreal. And in this one, what we wanted to test was a more realistic scenario. So a more realistic volume of sorry, gets a spill in a more realistic situation. So in the shoreline environment, we do recover it, and then we try to treat these systems with some sort of remediation technique. So what happens? So the systems are similar, but in this case, you can see that these are shoreline enclosure, which are logistically more challenging, because sealing an enclosure that includes a shoreline is much more challenging, but that was the only way of doing it. And what we did is we set up these enclosures between the water and the shoreline, and we spilled about 1.5 liters of diluted bitumen in the first year. And then this was continued in future years with conventional crude oil. And we left this oil there for a little bit. Then we tried to recover it, and then we remediated. So those remediation techniques that I've mentioned, we wanted to apply were mainly enhanced monitor natural recovery. So natural recovery would be just leaving it for the microorganisms in the lake to do their thing. Enhance means we are going to add some nutrients to kind of balance those nutrient ratios. Of course, the oil contains a lot of carbon, but if there's not equivalent proportions of nitrogen and phosphorus to allow for that carbon to be consumed by the organisms, they are not going to do it. We also tested a shoreline cleaner or a shoreline washing agent, Corexit EC9580A, which is not allowed for freshwater use. It wasn't then, and it is not now in freshwater, but it is allowed for shoreline cleaning in marine environments. But because we are in a unique situation where we are allowed to contaminate things on purpose, we could actually test whether it would work in our systems or not. And then, I'm going to talk, that's the floater study about the engineering floating wetlands. And there is a last little piece of this puzzle, which is a kind of a spin-off part of this project, which we call it the Prove It study, where we actually did do the invasive remediation. We actually dug the shoreline out to see what the effect of that physical manipulation was, and whether it was better or worse than the oil impacts themselves. So again, these are our systems sealed to the shoreline to allow for that spill. The way that we did it is we actually, for this one, we wanted to simulate an oil that had kind of run through land before getting to the water. So we prepared these evaporation pans where we let the oil evaporate for 48 hours. So it is aged oil, like it would be if a spill had happened over land and eventually would have made it to the shoreline. We have here the composition of the two oils that we used, the dilbit on the first year and the conventional heavy crude oil that was used later on. And you can see in the dilbit particularly, there's more of the lighter ends, just because of the diluent that's present in there. As I mentioned, you can see in the picture here on the left, we applied around 1.5 liters of oil. Then we tried, I think it was left for 48 hours. and then we tried to recover as much as we could with absorbent pads and a little bit of washing, which was either with just water. Sorry, yeah, I know time is running out. Yeah, so sorry.
You can finish up. You can finish up.
Yeah. So we ran this study and then obviously monitor the same things as we saw before with the different elements. And I just want to point out, we did it in two environments, a wetland substrate and a rocky cobble, but I'm not going to talk, well, I'm not going to talk about any right now, but I'm definitely never going to talk about the shoreline because it gives us a lot of trouble logistically with sealing the enclosure. So it was a little bit problematic. Gonna go very fast to some of the results, and I'm just gonna mention for the second half with the heavy crude oil, we didn't use the Corexit, and that's because we saw marginal benefit of actually using it. But in fact, we saw the relatively substantial effects on both the mesocosm work as well as some spin-off work that we did in smaller systems that showed that the mortality of organisms living in the air-water interface was pretty much 100% at any concentration of the cleaner. So definitely not recommended, and that's our position. We don't recommend its use. And I'm going to skip a few slides, but just mentioning we did do the Prove It study. So we did clear the shorelines eventually, and the data has been analyzed right now. So I don't have an answer right now as to whether the minimally invasive techniques or the more aggressively invasive techniques, how they compare, but I can come back in future years and let you know. And finally, just mentioning the final project, the floater project. This was focused solely on seeing whether engineered floating wetlands could help on the recovery by providing a lot of substrate. So the roots of the plants are hanging in these systems, and they provide a lot of nice environment for bacterial growth and other microorganisms. So we were hoping that by providing it as additional surface area, we could kind of expedite the remediation of the systems. And the answer is yes, but perhaps not as much as we would have hoped. So with that, because I want to make sure that there's time for questions, I'm going to leave it there. Let me go to the question. There you go. Here you have my contact. And I'm very happy to chat about any of these projects or put you in contact with the right people that led specific aspects, because I don't know all the things. But yeah, if you have any questions, please. Let's have a chat.
Thank you so much. Jose, this was a great presentation, super impressive amount of work. Thank you. We've gotten a comment about your slides being very nice and easy and clean and lots of photos, and we appreciate that as well. So one of the questions that we have is about the benthic invertebrates that you were looking at in your boreal study. And were there certain taxa of benthic invertebrates that seem to have a greater effect at that air-water interface than others? Did you notice a trend there with certain taxa being more impacted?
It wasn't very taxa specific. On the benthic side of the actual samples from the sediment, there wasn't any effects really. So it wasn't individual to the specific taxa. And in the surface, it was virtually 100% effect. So any organism that attempted to cross that air-water interface would just not make it. Didn't matter whether it was a mayfly, a chironomid, or a dragonfly. They just couldn't cross it. And it didn't need much. We saw effects in our lowest treatment, which didn't have any actual sleek. It was just sheen. And as I mentioned, we saw the sheen pretty much becoming 100% coverage every night, the moment that the wind disappeared. So it would be a substantial effect. That follow-up study that we did was actually with water striders and other surface organisms. And yeah, it was virtually 100% kill. So the problem is if you do get 100% coverage overnight, then there's no refuge for them. So that's where our worries came from.
Okay, yeah. All right. We have gotten a question about whether or not the slides will be available. And I just want to mention for everyone's benefit that the webinar is being recorded, and we are going to caption the webinar. and then put that up on the Hazardous Material Transport Outreach Network's webinar webpage, as well as Minnesota Sea Grants YouTube channel, as well as Lake Champlain's YouTube channel, Sea Grants YouTube channel. So many places that you'll be able to view that in a couple of weeks when we get it all captioned and ready to go. One of the questions we've gotten is whether or not you have studied peat as a potentially beneficial absorbent agent.
The answer is both yes and no, not directly, but that's one of the things we wanted to look at in a way on the original design of the floater project, where we have the rocky cable versus the wetland. Unfortunately, the rocky cable gave us some logistical issues. Like we couldn't really get the enclosures to seal because there was too much porous material between the rocks. So the results are not great to actually answer that question. We did see relatively good binding of some of the oil constituents to the organic matter in the sediment, but it's hard for us to tell whether it was the peat or other portions, and we didn't actively have a specific test of manipulating by adding peat, for example. This would be natural appearing from the wetland environment. Okay.
Thank you. So we are running a little short on time. So what we're going to do is one more wrap-up question, and it's a two-part question. So one is, did you study any of the lake bottom life? So plants, other benthic organisms, after the oil was cleaned up in that boreal study, if you took it out that far? And then were there any fish or wildlife introduced into those enclosures during the course of that study?
Yeah, so I think this question is for the boreal, so the water column. Yes, one thing I like saying whenever someone asks what we usually look at these studies is we measure anything that we can think of and we can afford, because they are a one-off. So this is just a small little tidbit, but we looked at everything from the microbial communities, including C14 incorporation on the tissues, zooplankton, phytoplankton, the whole food web. So we do have data for all those pieces. In general, not a lot of effects, which was surprising. But we did include fish. So we usually fish out any fish that could have been trapped, particularly on these large enclosures, and then we add our own. So we know the number that we're putting and the sex ratios, if that's useful. So we added a number of fathead minnows to the enclosures, and we did have some data for that. There were some deformities observed on the higher treatments, but the data is a little bit noisy. We did some ex situ exposure in the lab under more controlled conditions to fathead embryos that we collected from the wild populations of the lake. And in those, we do see a relatively good concentration response on things like deformities and other more traditional fish endpoints. So we do have some fish data.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Ode to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're getting close to 1 p.m. here Eastern time, so we're gonna have to wrap up here. I just want to sincerely thank our presenter, Dr. Rodriguez Gil, for his very insightful presentation. And again, I want to congratulate for the clarity of your presentation. And I also want to say that I keep on my mind that you said you would be happy to come back again to present some of your future results. So, we're going to stay in touch.
Perfect.
Thank you also to all of our webinar participants for taking the time to be with us today.